Okay, we're live.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kinneret Gordon, and I am the lead research community officer on the Wikimedia Foundation research team. I would like to welcome you to this month's Research Showcase. Research Showcases are monthly convenings organized by our team to recognize and share recent research on or relevant Wikimedia projects. For those of you joining live, we welcome you to ask questions from the speakers in the YouTube chat. We will monitor this channel and pass questions to the speakers at the end of their presentations. We kindly ask that attendees follow the friendly space policy and the universal code of conduct. Before we get started, I have one quick announcement that call for proposals for the upcoming round of the research fund will go out in the next couple of weeks. Please expect an update via our regular communication channels such as WikiResearchL and the WikiResearch Twitter account in regards to the exact dates in the next couple of weeks. I will now pass it over to my colleague Pablo, who will introduce this month's theme and speakers.
Okay, thank you, Kinneret. I'm Pablo Aragón, research scientist at the Wikimedia Foundation, and I'm glad to introduce the speakers on the topic of our showcase today. Wikipedia and the projects of the Wikimedia ecosystem are quite different from many of the platforms that exist on the internet. And one of the most notable differences is their governance. User-generated content in many social media is expected to comply with a usually very general set of terms and conditions that are designed by the owners of the platform. In contrast, Wikimedia content has to be aligned with a set of rules and policies that are created by members of the community. And some of these policies have become core pillars for Wikimedia projects to be what they are today. And we should note that rules might differ across projects, and also they evolve over time as they need to address emerging challenges for information literacy. For that reason, our September 2023 Research Showcase will focus on rules in Wikipedia. And for this exciting topic, we have outstanding researchers today. First, Zachary J. McDowell, assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His research focuses on access and advocacy in digital-mediated peer production spaces, in particular on digital literacy, self-efficacy, and how digital-mediated tools like Wikipedia shape these areas of inquiry. And Zachary will be presenting with Matthew A. Bater, professor of English and affiliate faculty in the Composition and Applied Linguistics PhD program at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. His research asks questions related to technology, writing, and digital culture. Their talk will focus on Wikipedia community policies and experiential epistemology, critical information literacy, social justice, and inclusive practices. And after that talk, we will have a presentation by So-Young Huang, PhD student in the Media, Technology, and Society program at Northwestern University. She will present her research on variation and overlap in the peer production of community rules. And in this talk, she particularly will focus on a comparative study of self-governance and rule-making activity in the 5 largest language edition of Wikipedia. As usual, after this talk, we'll have 10 minutes for discussions, and we are happy to take your questions in the chat on YouTube. My colleague Isaac will monitor that channel and relay the questions during the Q&A. So with this, let's pass it into Zachary and Matthew.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen and we can get going. All right. Okay. So thank you very much for having us. As you can see, the title of the talk is, there's a lot of words here because this is going to be an overview of quite a bit of research, probably over the last 8 years between Matt and I. And this research is not only informed by all the kind of interactions we've had, but also a combined 20 years of, maybe more now, of teaching with Wikipedia. My name is Zach McDowell. I am an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I am in the Department of Communication. I started teaching with Wikipedia as a grad student, and that is actually how Matt and I met. And we ended up, here's a plug for our free book. It is available open access, as it should be, from All Things Wikipedia. Matt?
Hey everybody, I'm Matt. I'm at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, which is confusingly enough outside Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. So happy to be here, like Zach, a longtime kind of education plus Wikipedia researcher. The book, though, is really more of a policy analysis and a cultural analysis of Wikipedia's kind of impact as an arbiter of knowledge. So we'll make frequent references to the book throughout our talk. We'll also be referencing a few other research articles and studies that we've done as well. So a quick overview of our talk today, which is really building from this a study that we published recently in the journal Social Media and Society. You can see the citation there at the bottom. Wikipedia as open educational practice, experiential learning, critical information literacy, and social justice. We will go through some of the slides kind of fairly quickly, but all of the relevant research is available on the bibliography slide. I can also share our slides in the chat, which are hosted on Commons, or you can kind of search on Wikimedia Commons for that as well. Briefly, we'll be discussing, what we're calling the information literacy crisis in the context of the changing media landscape. So much is happening right now with generative AI. There's a lot of challenges that in particular the Wikimedia community is facing. We'll also be focusing on a framework for information literacy put out by the Association of College and Research Libraries, which I think has been very forward-thinking in terms of being able to capture some of the necessary information literacy skills and practices that anyone needs, right? Not just students, but anyone. The main thrust of our talk is really on Wikipedia policy as an opportunity for experiential learning, right? And Zach's going to talk more about that experiential learning or experiential epistemology. But we're also going to be making connections between opportunities for information literacy and opportunities for getting newcomers to the encyclopedia to think about knowledge equity, systemic biases, gaps, etc. Right? Finally, we'll discuss the dangers of what we call the Wikipedia detour. And this is where we'll kind of get into more of the recent changes to the information landscape, the media landscape, as AI systems become more and more frequent throughout our lives.
So as everybody's pretty much aware, I think you'd have to be living in a cave somewhere to not understand that a lot of people perceive that there is a major, fake news crisis, information literacy crisis. These things are all very much connected. And, despite all that being pretty terrible, what is really nice is that Wikipedia has come out as a shining star. From 20 years ago, when people were told don't even look at Wikipedia because it's just a bunch of people who randomly edit this and it's made out of garbage. Wikipedia has now become the place in which even mainstream media is saying, hey, maybe you should go to Wikipedia and look at that, rather than some other place. So it's very nice because, again, a lot of our research points to the same things, and a lot of research through many years have shown that Wikipedia is as or more reliable than other sources. And these are just a couple of papers that we've released in the last few years that really kind of shows what we're going to be pulling from a lot of throughout this, to try to kind of blend together to show you the different aspects of how this comes together.
Exactly. So this slide, you can kind of see a little bit of our research paradigm here, visually illustrated. We are doing kind of a meta-analysis of previous research studies One of the biggest ones is McDowell Veteran Stewart from 2019, Computers in Composition, large-scale survey of both students and instructors using Wikipedia education or enrolled in that particular program. But we're also building from some smaller studies and in general our, as Zach mentioned, kind of decade experience of teaching with Wikipedia, doing workshops, participating in the movement itself. So we're doing kind of a meta-analysis of previous research to illustrate some of the main takeaways that you can use to bridge research and practice. We're hoping in particularly to spark some conversations regarding information literacy, representation, even the future of Wikipedia, right? We're gonna talk briefly at the end about what we call that Wikipedia detour, because we recognize that even in some of the open meetings of the movement, there's a direct indication of some of the challenges facing Wikipedia, such as knowledge graph or other ways that users are being kind of directed away from the site and don't always understand how important Wikipedia is downstream, right, as it's being used in all these other kinds of applications.
So many of you who have edited Wikipedia or work with Wikipedia, we might have forgotten some of the kind of steps in which it takes to participate in the Wikimedia authorship. And so what we want to remind you is that there are a lot of kind of like steps. Even if it's not steps, might be a terrible infographic because it might not even be steps, because these are things that you have to learn throughout and increase, such as the evaluation of information, not only where it comes from, but also what's missing, how you choose articles or topics. All of these are really important steps in that pair with very fundamental kind of ways that you need to learn information literacy. And really, this is going to pair with these 6 frames for information literacy here. The next few slides are going to go over some of the research and that article that was mentioned here, and the Wikipedia as Open Educational Practice. What we did in that was read a variety of kind of policies and on Wikipedia, as well as kind of how things work through these frames to understand overlapping ways of thinking about information. Because the 6 frames here, they're, rather than being prescriptive, such as the ways that we used to think about information literacy, like do this, understand what this is. Instead, these are descriptive frames to understand kind of how people have these kind of interconnected ways of understanding knowledge. And that helps build robust information literacy, or what Dana Boyd calls antibodies not to be deceived. But more than these antibodies, these frames illustrate where learners are gaining insight and deep understanding where information comes from, how it's used, and how to understand it in a more comprehensive and interconnected way. And this research that we've done on and assessed how people learn to use Wikipedia is really kind of illustrating the learnings that what we refer to as experiential epistemology. And it's essentially like they are experiencing that the frame and the all of these kind of like the way that information comes together, rather than just trying to learn about it. Again, this is it's about experiencing it rather than just having it told to you, which really embeds these kind of skills in a much more robust way.
So the first frame put out by the ACRL, again, Association of College and Research Libraries, addresses authority. Authority is constructed and contextual. And this is a long-standing concern in much of our research. As a writing studies person, I come to the table trying to think about how can students understand authority? How can they gain authority in their own writing? How can they understand the authority or the lack of authority of sources when they're evaluating information, et cetera? And what we've found in our research is that through this kind of experiential epistemology, novices to Wikipedia, students and other novices, can begin to kind of recognize the complex system of authority that scaffolds Wikipedia and how to interact with it. So chapter 2 of our book is actually really goes into how we kind of understand and theorize that complex system. You know, it's an interplay between these important policies like neutral point of view, verifiability, no original research, right? It's an interplay between those policies and the genre, as well as the kind of long-standing encyclopedic epistemology, which is, you know, as a tertiary source, always operating from other secondary sources, right? So for each of these frames, we actually have some quotes from students from some of the qualitative data, but we also have some relevant research from some library science researchers, actually, Lori Bridges, to kind of reflect on and interpret some of these frames. So this is a student quote. I love this. And this really reflects the kind of the value that qualitative research can bring to these discussions as well. we're not gonna read the quotes. You guys can kind of look at those and you can access the slides as well. But to me, this is really an amazing kind of quote because it demonstrates the kind of massive perception shift that the student or the novice to Wikipedia undergoes as they're kind of starting to learn about some of those behind the scenes operations, right? Like what's actually happening behind the actual article, on talk pages, on Wikipedia project pages that host those policies, throughout the editorial history, etc. You can go to the next slide.
Oops.
It's okay. Okay, so moving right along, the second frame from the ACRL is all about process. A big thing for teachers of writers, but what's especially important about this is that the process of information creation in Wikipedia comes with these particular checks and balances for vetting the information, right? And through that experiential epistemology, novices have to also go through that particular process. They have to navigate some of these policies like neutral point of view, no original research, and verifiability, right? So here we have another student quote, and the student is referencing really what I think of as the kind of radical transparency of the encyclopedia, right, as it manifests in Wikipedia. For them, they're kind of talking about the writing process, but it also has tremendous implications for processes of information literacy and vetting information, right? A lot of the emergent kind of generative AI chatbots, they're still not really able to be transparent about where they're getting their information, what their sources are coming from, right? Google Knowledge Graph is doing a little better with this in terms of like, okay, I got this from Wikipedia, or I got this from a movie index, etc. But a lot of the emergent AI isn't doing enough. Okay. So the third frame for information literacy is related to the value of information, right? Which for us and for our research really resonates particularly with the ways that Wikipedia has become such an important arbiter of public knowledge, an index of public knowledge, and thus also, without getting like too philosophical, an arbiter of reality itself, which of course is the subject of our book. So Wikipedia and kind of its uneven terrains, if I can steal a phrase from Mark Graham, is a way to think, a way to, a way into, a way through to think about the different values given to information through representation, right? So Mark Graham's phrase uneven terrains references kind of the often over-representation of some things, right, on the English Wikipedia, as well as under-representation of other items. And these have significant implications for newcomers that newcomers to Wikipedia need to understand. And here we have another student quote. It's not random. The information that's missing from Wikipedia, it's a history of knowledge of the events that have been documented and historicized in the world. So that third frame, the student is able to kind of see that value that the information has and is able to see how, in participating in that experiential learning process, they can do more to work through systemic biases and address systemic biases.
So the fourth frame here, and I'm going to speed it up a little because we're running short. The fourth frame is research as inquiry. It helps think through how people put information together in Wikipedia as a space of compiled information. Although Wikipedia doesn't allow the traditional kind of synthesis of information, no synth, but what it is instead is a compilation. And really, in a way, it is a synthesis because it's taking a variety of different voices and combining them to tell a whole story, a story that should be represented in a neutral way, but still it is a combination. And the student here is saying that they're far more aware of these articles. I love how they, a lot of these quotes are like, they're like, oh, and something or whatever. And we kept that in because these are real quotes and they're trying to work through these ideas. They're saying that they're being more aware of like where the sources are coming from because they're able to kind of see how things are connected. The next one, scholarship is conversation, is really, it's not just about the kind of that it is, as these are all interconnected, right? They're not just individual frames. They have a lot of overlapping ideas. And the last one really blends with this because this is about not only the conversation that you can see when you're reading a Wikipedia page, because you can see how these different information pieces come from different sources and how that represents a conversation, especially when it comes to things like scientific articles and how it can, and because of NPOV, you have to represent a variety of different ways in which, things have been discussed. But also on the backside, and this is Dowell and Bridges here, they're really talking about this scholarship as conversation by also seeing how the students can, or all learners can view how Wikipedians talk about the actual article coming together. They can see the actual meta conversation that is emerging that forms the framework for how things get represented. And then finally here, searching is strategic exploration. Really is talking about how learning to evaluate sources is not a simple task. It is increasingly difficult in a complex media landscape. And these contributors need to understand, right, as Dowell and Bridges say, searching does not always produce adequate results. People are used to this idea where they search on Wikipedia, or they search on Google, they get the first thing, they look at the knowledge graph. People are used to a lot of information that they can just ask their, personal digital assistants. I'm not going to say any of the names to spark them off, and then they get an answer. And then they're happy with that answer rather than understanding that they need to dig deeper to understand these things. And this is a lifelong process that can really affect the way in which people understand all information.
Excellent. So I'm gonna shift gears a little bit to kind of talk about social justice work, social equity work, and how our research has uncovered opportunities for addressing systemic biases in Wikipedia. And a big part of at least my realization about this was a large-scale survey I did with Jiawei Xing. It's published in First Monday, should be in the bibliography, that actually asked instructors that were participating in wiki education about why they were motivated to do that, right? And that research has shown that there's this emergent group of instructors, but also potential Wikimedia contributors who are really motivated by social justice and knowledge equity concerns, right? And what we would like to do is really call on Wikimedia, the Wikimedia community to kind of leverage that group of people in both educational projects as well as more public intellectual work with wiki projects and other knowledge equity initiatives. So we're thinking especially like Whose Knowledge, Afro Crowd, these initiatives that are really trying to work towards bridging the gap in terms of some of these systemic biases. But a lot of it really comes back to this, and we're going to come back to the policy here, recognizing that verifiability itself is kind of what we have called a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, it's so important in teaching information literacy, right? And I've noticed as well that the large language model, the Wikipedia policy on the large language model is also taking a similar approach, right? Like to vet, take care, and share, make sure that what you're using is actually working towards the information's reliability. But also on the other hand, it's like blocking indigenous and folk knowledges that are not based in these print-centric and published sources, right? So we need to keep the community dynamic, recognizing that fifth pillar, especially in order to stay flexible for the ever-changing media landscape.
So here, we're also thinking about that appropriation of Wikipedia content starts to have devastating effects on Wikipedia's ecosystem, because not only, and this is a quote from Jemenliak, is users rarely know what their answers, that their answers are coming from Wikipedia when it comes to Google Knowledge Graph, generative AI, and a lot of other things. Even like TikTok is like just there, it's just a voice, reading Wikipedia, or somebody actually just reading Wikipedia to them. They don't know this. But also this is precluding users from accessing and experiencing Wikipedia because they don't know it's coming there, because they're not clicking through, or they don't have the option to. It reduces the ability to find new editors, new users, and potential donors. Although I don't think, there hasn't been a huge problem with that lately. Wikipedia has a distinct problem recruiting new editors, particularly in diversifying editorship, which is also there in this in Jemenliak's study as well. But really, in the end here, we want to say that this is a really quick rundown of a lot of work that Matt and I have done over the last 8 years. And I want to kind of close it with kind of 3 main things. One, despite some of the issues with representation biases, Wikipedia's policies have shown to have incredible effects to help teaching information literacy in an increasingly complex mediated space. 2, if the community and researchers can come together to explore better ways to combat systemic biases and find new ways to expand representation on Wikipedia, it only gets better. There are many projects that are doing quite a bit, and some of the people here are like literally on this Zoom call that are doing this amazing work. But some of these other issues, such as the representation of indigenous knowledge, are baked into the system, and we need to address them. And 3, all of this remains threatened by the increased detours to Wikipedia, not just the knowledge here that is under threat, but its potential for change that makes Wikipedia so special. It's the community that is committed to providing access to the world's knowledge that has created the space that teaches not just about topics, but about the interconnectedness of information, and creates a space that allows for representation of the underrepresented. So let's work on ensuring we can keep that going. Thank you very much.
Well, so many ideas in this talk. I was not familiar with the theory of experiential epistemology and find it so appropriate for Wikipedia. I thank you very much for sharing this. I don't know if we have, I think we don't have questions on YouTube yet, but Isaac, I think you mentioned that you have a question. So please unmute yourself.
Sure. I can start with my first question. It's on the difference, I think, between like showing versus doing. And I was thinking in particular, I think it was point number 2 about process, and the student had the quote about, understanding how the article has evolved. And it makes me wonder, one idea would be, oh, well, maybe if we had better visualizations, for instance, that would show a reader, like, here's how this article evolved, and wondering just how close that gets you to the understanding you build by attempting to actually like add a revision to that article. And if you all have thoughts on that.
I can start with that real quick. One of my favorite videos that is really old right now is this. Somebody did this great video on the evolution of the heavy metal umlaut. And it's great because it goes through there and they explain the process and they watch. And so my students will watch as this weird little article about the heavy metal umlaut comes around. They even can see how there was vandalism, how it gets erased and everything. And that's just from somebody just paging through, right? All the edits. So I think that I don't know if we need a bunch of extra tools or whatever to show that. I wish somebody would remake that video because it's kind of getting old at this point. But what we need is to be able to illustrate that in ways that then they can go find and see that they can experience themselves. And that's really what it comes down to, is they can see this come together very quickly, and then they're like, oh wow, this is how easy to do it. I can do it. But then they also realize the complexity of it. And so like it's a lot of kind of layering of like different experiences and understandings that come together all at once.
Yeah, I'll just very briefly add, I think showing can be powerful. Having them actually experience it is doubly powerful, even when sometimes they have a negative experience, actually. Like it's not uncommon at all for students participating in WikiEd and trying to edit the English version to get their edits reverted, but it can still be very, very powerful because they actually connect all of the dots and they become a user in that experience.
Thank you both. Yeah, I like that, showing essentially as the spark for hopefully getting to doing the class now.
The important thing to remember, I think, that is that a lot of this is actually, a lot of Wikipedians take a lot of this for granted, but when you're teaching with it, you start to see like how these processes come together. And it's amazing how very simple things are incredibly powerful that we just sort of overlook a lot because we don't realize how incredible that process of learning is and how it changes the way that you fundamentally approach everything else in the world.
Can I jump in with a quick question? Well, first, thanks so much for the talk. It was really cool. But on the last slide, you mentioned that like one of Wikipedia's greatest potential is change. And I was wondering what you were thinking like of the role of rules in facilitating that kind of change.
I could take a stab at that one. It's definitely a big topic because the English Wikipedia is more, folks have used the term ossified in terms of its particular editing guidelines, behavioral guidelines, etc. But it's important to remember throughout all the, and especially when compared to other language versions, right, which you're going to see more dynamism, like more ability in younger Wikipedias for there to be more flexibility in rules. But for the English Wikipedia, it's important to remember that the community mediates the rules, right? And the community can reinterpret and can rewrite some of these rules and policies in order to create a more equitable encyclopedia. That's my short answer.
Okay, so it was great to discuss about limitations of only one Wikipedia and the temporal aspect of change, because I think this creates like a great intro for our second talk. So Jon, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Yeah, let me, sharing screen as always. Okay, there we go. Does that that showing up right? Okay, great. All right. Thanks for having me again. And I'm also so happy to be going after Zach and Matt because it really, I think there was a very nice segue just now. I've been talking about this work on variation and overlap in the peer production of community rules for quite some time. And I'm very excited to be sharing it at the showcase here. And like as we saw in the talk just now, we kind of know that the governance of Wikipedia happens through its communities of users, and the stakes to do pretty well at this is quite high. And the possibilities and potential when we do well is also immense, especially now that, as Wikipedia has downstream impacts with language models, augmenting Google search, et cetera, et cetera. But an important fact about these communities is doing this governance work is that they don't exist in isolation. Instead, they're networked and connected to one another. So if we want to understand the governance of systems like Wikipedia and their successes and failures, what we really need to do is also look across communities and get a sense of the governance ecosystem that they're starting to make up. So how they're creating a really complex arrangement of norms and values and governance practices, et cetera. And in the context of Wikipedia by communities, what I really mean is language editions. And I think of language editions in this study as kind of like connected, self-governing community organizations. And studying language editions, or at least like thinking of them in this way, is useful for our purposes, because we can see that language editions are distinct in their content and contributors, but they remain aligned in some key ways. And I think that these key ways is probably very familiar to the audience, but it's worth emphasizing because it's why they're like so interesting to compare as a set of communities from a social science perspective. So first, all the language editions share the same goal, producing a peer-produced encyclopedia. Second, they're hosted on the exact same wiki technology infrastructure where all the interactions are mediated on. And third, the language editions all follow the same self-governing model where people are collectively participating in the rulemaking and rule enforcement in their respective communities. And so, taking together all the ways that these communities are the same, we want to know, are the rules the same? Are the governing practices that they come up with the same as well? And that brings us to the research questions that was driving the project that is kind of what I'm primarily drawing on for this talk. So first, how do the patterns of rulemaking over time compare across language edition communities? And second, how do the sets of rules become more or less similar over time across the language edition communities? And in the study, we conducted a descriptive study, basically examining the rules and rulemaking on the 5 largest language editions. So that's English, French, German, Japanese, and Spanish. And we do this because they have comparably long and rich histories to examine, covering almost 20 years. But it is, of course, true that this would be interesting if we could extend this further especially to the smaller communities, I think. The details of the exact research method are available in the manuscript, which I'll share a link at the end, but I think it's also available online on the research showcase and my website. And I'll just give a brief overview here so that we can set the groundwork a little. So first, we constructed a list of rules per community. Rules aren't actually identified in like exactly the same ways across communities, which already point to some organizational differences. But what that really just means is that we had to develop a consistent logic for what would be included as a formal rule in analysis. And this came out to like something like 700 rules or so that I manually went through. And then for the rules, we collected their revision histories to understand their development over time through the view of their edit logs. And we also collected something called interlanguage links. And this is a technical feature of Wikipedia that connect like conceptually equivalent pages across wikis if those pages exist. So like if there is a Wikimedia Research Showcase page on the English Wikipedia and on the Spanish Wikipedia, they should be connected with an interlanguage link. So in the case of rules, it indicates whether rules are shared or not across these language editions. Oh, And then finally, using all this data, we conducted our descriptive analysis. So in the next few slides, I'm going to highlight some of the main findings and kind of talk about them and what they suggest. So first, directly to the question about rulemaking patterns. When we compare the patterns in rules and rulemaking over time across the wikis, we saw noticeably similar trajectories across all of them. So here I'm showing a set of figures A, B, and C. And panel A is showing rule creation over time, and panel B is showing rule activity over time. And we can see that in both cases, most rule pages were created and most actively revised in something like the first 5 years or so of rulemaking activity. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to figure B, because it is showing this rise and decline pattern, which is pretty well documented in patterns of editing article content on English Wikipedia specifically. And what we're seeing here is that this is also true for governance page content and also across language editions. And finally, panel C is showing that the revisions of rule-related pages shift towards discussion of rules in proportion rather than revision of the rule text itself. So, amidst the kind of declining rate of revision that we're already seeing in figure B, figure C is telling us that people are increasingly unlikely to actually edit the rules, although they might still discuss them. Additionally, we also note that revisions are getting smaller over time, which is shown by the red line on here, and the time between them is increasing. In other words, they're becoming less frequent. So this figure, along with the figure C that I had here, is something that was observed in earlier work by Brian Keegan and Casely Fiesler on English Wikipedia. And so here we're basically seeing how it extends to other language editions. And together, all of these figures really do suggest a shared pattern of formalization in terms of written rules across the language editions. And earlier we were kind of talking about, or we were hearing about ossification happening from Matt. And it is true that formalization is something that has been observed and discussed quite a lot in the context of English Wikipedia. And one of the key takeaways from our set of figures is that several rulemaking patterns that we observe in English Wikipedia, especially patterns that indicate a tendency towards formalizing, they replicate across non-English language editions. And from a researcher's perspective, this is good to know. There's so much work with so many interesting findings about self-governance that have looked to English Wikipedia, but because English Wikipedia can feel so exceptional in many ways, and it's large even compared to the other language editions, sometimes it can be a little hard to say how much those findings translate to other scenarios. But by looking across communities, our work does suggest that some of the lessons and challenges and takeaways from a very rich existing body of work about the trajectories that self-governance takes online might be more broadly generalizable in a way, right? And I think it might also help us kind of change how we perceive some of these patterns. So a lot of work suggests that formalization is undesirable. And even in my manuscript, we kind of take that tone of it's calcifying. And so what do we do? And part of this is because it runs counter to the sense of open participation, which has been shown to be a really a very real challenge in retaining newcomers and diversifying editors especially. But seeing it happen across communities does suggest that it may be part of the natural trajectory of stabilizing as a community too. And there must be some kind of benefit as well to this kind of stabilization, right? So rather than asking how to prevent formalization completely, some better questions to ask might be is formalization happening for the same reasons every time across these communities? And what does that mean when it's not? And what does that mean when it is? What do we know are the unwanted side effects of formalization, and how can we specifically target and mitigate them, and so on. One of the ways to think about what's happening as these communities formalize is, of course, simply looking at the actual rules and the resulting sets of rules. And so that brings us to the second research question, which is how the governance of these communities relate to one another. And before we go into how the rules are overlapping over time, I want to take a moment to contextualize like what are unique versus shared rules. So to understand the overlaps in rule sets, we're taking advantage of the interlanguage links that I mentioned earlier. So as a reminder, they should indicate if rules are shared / conceptually equivalent across communities. And the more interlanguage links a rule has, the more connected it is or more shared it is across the language editions. And in this study, we're focusing on just the links among the 5 wikis. So the highest numbered would be 4, like the 4 other wikis, right? And in the list of our like 700 or so rules, 28% of them have 4 interlanguage links. So they're completely shared across all the wikis, and 34% have none. So they are completely unique to one wiki. And overall, you can see from the descriptive numbers here that shared rules tend to be older, longer, a lot more widely referenced internally on Wikipedia, as well as more edited and edited by more people. So the question is, like, how do these overlaps start to change across the communities over time? And this panel of figures is showing the proportion of rules that have more versus less interlanguage links to other language editions over time. And the darker tones are indicating that the rules in that proportion are more widely shared. So you can see that over time, all 5 language editions are starting to like see a creeping increase in the proportion of rules that are more unique to them, so the lighter tones. Although the degree to which this happens is like quite variable, right? Shared rules are pretty dominant in the smaller wikis, Japanese and Spanish, while unique rules are more prominent in English and German, which were the largest 2 in terms of active editors when I did these analyses. But I will say that it's not actually completely explained by scale either, because French and German are actually not that different in size. But you can see that German looks a lot more like English Wikipedia. But in any case, while there is growth in more unique rules, attention to rules actually goes the other way. So that's the really interesting part here. The panel is now showing how revisions are distributed among widely versus less widely shared rules. And we're seeing that over time, editing activity like really substantially concentrates among rules that are widely shared, so the darker tones. And what this suggests is that people are like actively discussing and thinking about the broad shared rules. And I want to like recall the earlier figure that was showing how the edits are actually increasingly going to the discussion pages. So this is really about discussion, right? And this is an indication that a community is like really taking the time to make the rule its own, or as we might say, like internalizing the rule. A much broader body of work from political science underscores how internalizing rules is a really core ingredient for success in self-governance. And in Wikipedia, I think that like comes through in what we're seeing here. And there's also a lot more work to understand exactly what's happening when these rules are getting internalized and what that really implies, which I'll get back to in a moment. So for now, with the 2 figures together here, you can see how there's both a sense of divergence and convergence in the rules that communities are developing, discussing, and using. Attention is going to these broad rules, which emphasizes their like kind of shared importance and value across communities. But this also means that communities might be individually changing the meaning of those rules over time. And this is also supplemented by the fact that the count of unique rules is going up. So what are like the key takeaways from this? I think there's 2 main ones. First, communities that are aligned in key ways. So earlier I was talking about goals and technology and governance models, but through the slides, we've been seeing that also they're aligned in their core rules and their rulemaking patterns. So despite being the same in all of these ways, they still develop substantial and sustained institutional variations in practice. And this is evident not only in the kind of continued edits and discussion concentrating on shared rules, but also in the growth of more unique ones. And second, the broad, widely shared rules that we are observing to have continued importance may be a really key factor in helping to coordinate communities towards shared goals. So insofar that Wikipedia has worked pretty well so far, we might reasonably expect that whatever communities are doing to internalize rules has not been like completely disastrous for the most part, right? I am aware that there's some cases where like wikis have had some problems with neutrality, but they tend to be kind of exceptional outliers. So how this works, this like coordination through rules works, is a question I think for future work that I would love to explore. If we're seeing variations in practice, like our figures are starting to suggest, like when is variation bad and when is it too much? I think understanding when broad rules fail to coordinate communities adequately towards shared goals is really important, because if a community breaks away from a shared goal and produces harms, it impacts other communities in turn. And on Wikipedia, I think this has some like particular implications for safeguarding against misinformation or informational harms across these distinct self-governing spaces. So to sum it up, there are some, I would say there's like 3 core trends that our work is emphasizing. So first, we see the shared patterns of formalization, and an increased second, we're seeing an increasingly diverging set of rules across these communities. And this is third supplemented by, or complemented with the finding that there's a continued importance of shared rules, which may or may not be evolving in different ways. And I do want to say, of course, our analysis is limited to 5 language editions, and some of the patterns here are pretty like at a high level. But what we are seeing overall is like a story about how communities are adopting and internalizing rules. And I think this is a story that matters for many other platforms, which are increasingly relying on communities and users to govern. And like when platforms are doing this, community rules become basically the fundamental mechanism around which the successes and failures of online governance occur. And with the scale and history of Wikipedia, understanding how it's happening on Wikipedia is not only practically important for thinking about like the downstream impacts on Wikipedia, but also for gaining a lot of valuable insights and lessons for how we govern and organize online more broadly. So to that end, here are some like directions for future work that have come up in discussion in the past, and that I've also been thinking about. So first is like the question of scale, right? So we are still looking at pretty large communities in this study, and I think it would be super interesting to look at smaller communities and what it means for them to be internalizing rules successfully. And second is the question of characterizing community-specific roles. I think this is really a complement to the first, like what kinds of roles are unique and what makes them so. I did take like a non-systematic peek at unique roles, and I will say a lot of these unique roles tend to be quite complementary to the broad shared roles, so rather than like adversarial in some ways. And then finally, there's like a lot of work to be done to understand how enforcement of broad shared rules varies. Are language editions using the same rules to different effects? Is there variation within a language edition that we should be keeping an eye on? How can we address like harmful effects that we might see, or leverage the rules in different ways to combat biases and stuff like that? Very happy to chat about any of these or anything else. Thank you. And here's our contact information for both myself and Aaron, who is my advisor and the supervisor of this project.
Thank you very much, Ayum, for presenting this amazing work. So we have already some questions here in the room. Let's start with Isaac, Matt, and then Caroline.
Thanks, Pablo, and thanks, Soyun. Really interesting talk. I'm going to try to kind of phrase this well, but I was thinking about what you were sharing and about what Matt and Zach shared earlier, and trying to connect the two, and wondering about kind of where, as a new editor, it becomes really important to start understanding some of these nuances of the rules and differences maybe across language editions. And there's a second part of this that I was saying, and that would be welcome Matt and Zach's input on this then. That's about like, I assume you've generally been teaching to English Wikipedia communities, and like taking Soyun's work into mind, like, does the class look dramatically different if you're teaching to a class that's going to be editing a different language edition?
So I have not a lot, but I have some experience. I've done some work down in Ecuador where we've done like miniature edit-a-thons with students, and specifically around representation of indigenous women. And if there's one thing, I mean, I would say a lot of the takeaways for learning things is very similar, but it is so much easier for them because first of all, there's a lot more knowledge gaps that are easy to fill, and second of all, they're a lot less persnickety when it comes to are you sure you want to cite that kind of thing. So I found that representation of knowledge there is a little bit easier there is a little bit of a lower bar now in the smaller Wikipedias, because there's a lot more work to be done, right? And with the besides just the ossification of all the rules, but like now people just done a lot in Wikipedia, so there's a lot less spaces to fill that are low-hanging fruit, right? There's obviously huge knowledge gaps, but one of the reasons for that is because of systemic knowledge representation with where are these sources. So people have been able to find the low-hanging fruit in a lot of the English Wikipedia much easier. So I found it to be a little bit easier when it comes to that. But I think the takeaways for the students have been very similar, especially when it comes to that. They're really motivated because especially there, they see there's even bigger gaps, and they're like, how is my town that I grew up in not covered in Spanish Wikipedia? So because especially the Spanish language Wikipedia has a huge issue with knowledge gaps around South America. So they were finding a lot of things in Ecuador that just didn't even have pages.
Yeah, I think similarly, like in the journey to like kind of close gaps across language editions, I think there are people who are like doing kind of cross-lingual editing quite a bit. I was lurking on Tea House the other day, and someone was asking like, why isn't this page qualify as a page on English Wikipedia when it qualified on like this other Wikipedia that I've been looking at, and I want to bring it over. And then folks were talking about how the standards of neutrality and notability are different. And I think when people are trying to like bring stuff that are not local to that particular Wikipedia, that's when these like nuances start become trickier. And I think insofar that we are actively trying to start closing these gaps in that sense, that this is going to become more of an issue.
Thank you. Matt?
Well, thank you so much for this presentation. It's wonderful, great research. I'm kind of interested in like the granularity of your analysis. Were you able, or did you identify the kinds of types or classes of rules, for instance, behavioral, editorial, or content rules that were more divergent across? Like, did you kind of differentiate between the types of rules in that way in your analysis? And if so, what did you find?
So I actually did not, and part of this is because of my own like linguistic barriers for interpreting the rules fairly. Like I didn't, like I speak English and Korean and German, but only English and German are in this set. And I didn't want to like impose my own like misconstrued understanding of what's being said in these languages. So I kept it at a pretty coarse level. I think like in the future, if I were to try to do this, I might follow like an existing taxonomy of roles, like Eleanor Ostrom's taxonomy of roles for analyzing institutional development. But I think like my sense of what's more divergent or varied is really like these more complementary roles where people are developing extra rule pages to hash out or speak in greater depth about how they see like neutrality or something, or how they see notability applying for a particular case that they feel is more like culturally relevant maybe, or that happened to come up in discussion. So it now has its own page, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Matt and Soo-Young. The next one in the queue is Caroline.
I don't think we can hear you.
Cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Perfectly. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the presentation. I was thinking about your findings and conclusions related to the decrease in revisions to rules that you saw and formalization and pros and cons of formalization. And I was wondering about the role of like democratization or consensus building in the decision-making process surrounding rule revisions, which I'll admit I don't know a lot about. So my question is, were you able to incorporate any data or metadata about like requests for comment or voting on proposed changes to rules? In other words, I'm wondering, is it, well, maybe I'll let you answer the question and then I can follow up.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's like a really good question. I didn't incorporate like these more deliberative or consensus seeking processes because they map more to like a specific subset of rules. And here it's like a pretty broad set of rules. I am starting to develop like a research project about articles for deletion. So maybe I'll have more answers for you in like a few months or something to that end. I think one way that I probably could have gotten at this is maybe focusing specifically on like text mining the rural discussions themselves. But again, because of like the multilingual aspect, I was like, okay, maybe this is not within the scope of this particular project, but it's definitely a good thing for like next steps for sure. And especially now that there's a lot of more like multilingual tools that we can use to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that answers my question. I was thinking about like if it's possible that the decrease in changes to the rules you're seeing could, you know, have something to do with like perhaps like a growing importance in like consensus building before revision implementation. But yeah, I realize that's an additional project. So
thank you.
Cool. But thanks for the answer. I appreciate it.
Thanks. So thanks so much, Simon. This is really fascinating. And I think my first question is a little bit superseded by already your comment, which is sort of dependent on the idea of doing some kind of content coding on rules. But I was wondering about whether, when you mentioned that, I mean, in general, you saw sort of emergence of common patterns in rulemaking across language editions. And I was wondering if you had the chance, or if you're thinking about doing something in the future about the determinants of that emergence, right? So like, is it sort of, do we see it at a certain threshold for community size? Do we see it at a certain threshold for, you know, edit activity, for, you know, I just thought that would be an interesting sort of idea of seeing, like, you know, at what point does a community feel like they need to, you know, formalize? And I think kind of along similar lines, I'm really curious about whether there's a, it just sort of stimulated a thought in my mind about research I'm familiar with about sort of the role of norms entrepreneurs. So whether there are, because we know that there are certain folks who, participate in multiple language editions. And I was wondering whether there were sort of nodes of both, not just rules that were shared, but there were sort of folks who maybe had some role in promulgating kind of shared rules across these communities.
Okay, so I think there's like two questions. The first about the determinants and the second about like cross language contributors. So the determinants thing I think is super interesting, and I actually hadn't thought about it. So now I want to like go look at it. I will say I do think like scale definitely is taking a factor here, but it's not like I don't think it will explain completely everything, because there are like, even like with French and German, they were pretty similar in scale, and now French when I did the analyses, German was bigger than French, but now like French is bigger. And they have like slightly different patterns that we're seeing. French is a little more similar to the smaller ones, German is not. So I think there's also just like organizational tendencies that these communities are taking on that are making a difference. And in terms of cross-lingual contributors, I did not do this systematically, but I did look at it for a neutral point of view. And I actually found that like there's almost no cross-lingual contributors. And the ones that I were seeing were mostly bots. So I don't think that this is the case where people are like really systematically coordinating across the language editions rules. But that doesn't like foreclose the possibility where people are actually referring to other language editions as they make edits. Like the early revisions of Japanese Wikipedias, some of their rules, if you look at the comments, it's quite clear that they actually copied and translated it from English Wikipedia. So I think there's like a lot of different ways that they might be like subtly coordinating with each other or like kind of like trying not to reinvent the wheel here, right? So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, so again, thank you for your presentation. Like I truly appreciate when people get some existing work, like in your case, you took this work by Brian Keegan and Paisley Fisler in 2017. And I think like Isaac and I were attending to the presentation as PhD students of that paper. So it's like 6 years
That's
ago,
great.
7 years, well, 6 years ago, yeah. So you took it to address much more language editions. And this is great because this gives us like a deeper understanding of Wikimedia communities. And I'm very curious about the challenges, also because policy pages are not easy to analyze. So what were the main challenges that you have to address when studying policy pages in multiple language edition Wikipedia? And what have you learned that you can share with our community so that we can foster more multilingual studies?
Oh, that's a good one. I think the first is the language barrier. That one was like, especially when I was starting to develop the list of rules, I was mostly using Google Translate, but I spent a lot of time on it because I didn't want to mess up basically, especially for the languages that I didn't know. I didn't want to like unfairly misconstrue what they're constituting as rules and stuff. So fortunately, there is like fairly similar ways of categorizing rules across these communities, and that's why I focus mostly on these like higher level, like more coarser levels of analyses. I think like in terms of like what we can learn from for promoting multilingual tools or multilingual analyses. I think maybe, I don't know, maybe like, I think promoting what kind of multilingual tools have been trained on Wikimedia data would be helpful, because that we already know then that that's trained on the existing data set, and it can be a bit more reliable for the actual evaluations. Like one of the things that I had really wanted to do with this work was looking at rule content, but at the time it was really hard to figure out what kind of like text mining tools would actually be sufficient to to do this in a way that wouldn't like totally skew my results in a sense. I do think that maybe creating more opportunities for community engagement with the smaller communities would be really helpful, because in my case, I focused on the large communities, and part of that was like, I wasn't sure how to approach the smaller communities that I don't have like any linguistic or cultural ties to, without feeling like I was just extracting their labor. And so having these opportunities and help maybe like interfacing with researchers to understand like what are the problems communities want to get solved, because then it's not so much about like my curiosity as a researcher. Like I want it to be grounded in what the language editions want to know about cross-lingual dynamics.
Wow, that's a great answer. Like building those bridges with those small communities, I think is something that deserves a lot of our attention. So I think we have no more questions for one, so let's wrap up. Kineret, it's your turn. Thank you again.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you everyone for joining the showcase today and this very lively discussion. I especially want to thank our speakers, Zachary, Matthew, and Soyan. Thank you for your contributions today. The Wikimedia Research Showcase is made possible thanks to the lovely coordination team with my colleagues, Pablo and Isaac, so thank you both. Isaac was also managing the Q&A today, so thank you for that as well. I would also like to thank Emerald for the support with the audio and video. Our next showcase will be on Wednesday, October 18th, and we'll focus on data privacy. We're looking forward to seeing you all there. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.